It didn't echo through the church. It didn't sound beneath the arch of the Vatican. No photos were taken, no speeches made, no grand ritual. Just a single name quietly withdrawn, printed in the daily notice like any other routine update. But this name was a routine. It carried the kind of weight that changes a room's quiet, the kind of quiet that holds just before a storm breaks. Most who saw it kept reading, but the few who grasped what it meant paused. This wasn't simple bureaucracy. It was a signal, a bishop dismissed without disgrace, without reason, without farewell. And at the heart of that stillness, Cardinal Tagle sat motionless, mouth slightly open, as if a question lingered there. One he never asked, they said. He was rattled, not by what was announced, but by what wasn't, because the man removed wasn't reckless, wasn't tainted. He was solid, old school, dependable. So why this man? Why at this moment? Why would Pope Leo release someone who had given so much so faithfully, without even a stir in a place? Where cloud is often gauged and cheers, Pope Leo chooses to speak by absence. His choices subtract. And when they do, even the pillars of tradition seem to shift beneath their feet. This wasn't a reprimand. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't politics. It was something different, something that made even no stranger to Vatican tempest sit quietly. And all this wasn't about authority. It was about intention. And those attuned to deeper things knew what had just occurred. The church had moved forward again, not with clamor, but with clarity, because heaven doesn't need to raise its voice. It moves softly with breath, not brass, with timing, not tension. Outsiders, it looked like a routine memo. But those who know heaven never acts without purpose. Some lead by commands, others lead by presence. So subtle you might miss the moment the world tilted. Pope Leo XIV never shouted. Yet somehow everything leaned into here from the first dawn of his papacy. Began to shift the church, not by pressure, not by upheaval, but by pattern. Barefoot, he joined the procession, not stepping onto velvet, but onto stone, not quiet for show, but quiet in reflection of Christ's pain. Some called it a gesture, some called it modest. But among those kneeling by the roadside, another word passed in whispers prophetic, because Leo understood that the earth remembers what the church sometimes overlooks, and that to guide the church forward you may first need to touch its history with bare feet. Then came the gardens, those tucked behind. Vatican walls, once reserved for the powerful and far removed. Leo unlatched the gates, not for cameras, not for clergy, but for the forgotten in winter nights. There were no headlines, no stage photos, just warmth, just food, just human worth. The gardens, one style for status now, shelter the unseen beneath stars. Some said it was reckless, others saw rebirth. And then his clothing changed, the ornate rings disappeared, the silk, the shine, the gold, all set aside. He wore plain white without fame or decoration, and resting on his chest a simple wooden cross. It wasn't to dismiss the dignity of the role, but to remind it of its origin. He wasn't simplifying. He was elevating. Every garment, every stride, every quiet moment sent a message, not outward to crowd, but inward to the church itself. He was drawing the church closer, not back in time, but back to its foundation, to a time when leaders carried staffs, not scepters, when apostles knelt to wash, and the most powerful message came from a cross on a hill. Most didn't catch it at first. They were listening for fanfare. But Leo offered only quiet. He didn't hand out a program. He simply pointed hearts back to a person. And then piece by piece his choices began to speak. He didn't say, I will transform the church. He just walked without shoes, and the earth took notice. He didn't say, bring the poor in. He unlocked the gate, and Christ returned through the unnoticed entrance. He didn't claim to reform anything. He dressed simply. He said less, and slowly people began to pray in new ways. He grasped what most never learned. Loud shifts often collapse, but gentle ones reach the soul. And when the soul softens, it starts to hear again. Pope Leo XIV isn't crafting a new vision. He's recalling something ancient, something buried, so deep it had quietly turned sacred. That's why every appointment, every dismissal, every pause is met with reverence, because under Leo nothing is chance. Everything moves in rhythm. This is a rebellion, it's remembrance. And with each step, he takes the dust of scripture, stirs once more. Some describe him as hard to predict, but more and more begun to see him for what he truly is, not a reformer, but a mystic, a man attuned to what isn't spoken, a man who waits for silence to reveal its meaning. And in that quiet the church is slowly changing, not in belief, but in presence, not in declarations, but in how it stands, not in ceremonies, but in what it remembers. The world may still search for drama, but the saints are watching something quieter. They see the dust on his path, the worn sandals, the basin of water, the servant's attire, and they understand Leo hasn't come to push the church ahead. He's leading it inward. He hasn't come to make the church louder. He's showing how to hear again. He hasn't come to win over the world. He's making sure the church still walks with Christ. And that's why when a bishop quietly steps down, it resonates deeply spiritually, because with Leo every act carries weight, even the quiet even the decisions made, without announcement. Even the light that falls across the garden with a poor fine rest, nothing is random, anymore not under a pope who walks barefoot. And here's the Stone Speak. Subscribe to our channel, not for updates, but because you've noticed a quiver hidden in the stillness. And if not, step into the comments and answer this: what moments have you brushed aside simply because they didn't shout his name? Was Bishop Emeritus Co. Valente a man shaped not by trends, but by trial, not showy, but solid, unshaken, raised? In the hills near Milan, he entered the seminary in the fading days of the two Vatican Council. He had seen the church pivot once before, and from that moment, he committed to holding it steady. When the winds changed again, he wore his cassock with intention. He stood at the altar like a sentinel. His sermons were thick with Latin references. His decisions measured his stance, unwavering. People didn't admire him for charm. They trusted him. For his clarity, he didn't yield. He didn't soften. He didn't waver. He loved the church as one loves a stronghold, and he defended it as one guards a wall. For years, Bishop Valente served faithfully, first in Florence, then in Turin, and eventually he was appointed to lead a troubled diocese in the south of Italy. It was a place where corruption had dulled consciences and faith had grown quiet, and still he remained. No scandal attached to his name, no public failings, just order, just rules, the calm assurance of a man convinced that the church survives not by blending in, but by standing firm. But at times what we call strength is simply fear in ceremonial robes, and sometimes what passes for loyalty is really an unwillingness to shift, even when love added to that tension began to surface. When Pope Leo slowly turned his attention toward Cairo's diocese, it wasn't defiance, it wasn't pride, it was resistance, the quiet, steady kind that stands still while everything around it shifts. The barefoot walks too. Sentimental Valente would murmur, opening the Vatican gardens too. The poor risks what sacred, he'd say, softly welcoming priests from displaced communities, not wise for flock, he'd caution. He never raised his voice, he never launched an attack, but he didn't budge, not even slightly, and Leo watched not with anger, but with ache, because even then Leo believed Valente's devotion to the church was real, but love that refuses to hear can turn into something harder, something less sacred. And so one morning, quietly, and without drama, Bishop Valente's resignation was accepted. The notice read simply: effective immediately, no reason, no farewell. Those closest to him wept not for politics, but for what felt like pruning. When word reached Cardinal Tagle, he stayed silent. Later in private, he whispered to a single priest. Maybe God had seen it all along. Tagle had known him. They had prayed together, debated broken bread, argued over scripture. He respected Valente's strength, his clarity, his loyalty to the old ways, but truth, when stripped of gentleness, becomes a burden. And even iron, if it will not yield, must someday be laid down. Tagle didn't respond with anger. He mourned not just for Valente, but for an entire era. A generation of bishops taught a guard and preserved, now being asked to loosen their grip and Tagle quiet. And whether by years of bearing both the gospel and other sorrow, knew something many still miss, that following Christ sometimes means laying down the very strengths that once defined you. He didn't protest, he didn't defend, he simply remained, caught between love and release, because sometimes the most faithful act is a silence that carries pain. Valente wasn't a mistake. He wasn't the enemy. He was a close of a chapter God had already moved past. For those who knew him, the hurt wasn't just in the resignation. It was in what it revealed under Pope Leo. The church was no longer seeking men who stood tall, but those who could kneel, not protectors of stone, but carriers of compassion. And that change cost more than policy. It reached into bonds, into friendships, shared history, familiar rhythms. The ache wasn't only Valente's, it belonged to everyone who cherished what he stood for. It was the ache of seeing the future arrive before you'd had time to part with the past. Subscribe to Bible stories, teachings. If you've ever learned that obedience can feel like sorrow, and that sorrow too belongs to holiness, and if not, speak below. What might you still be holding that God is already calling you to let go of? He wasn't a name anyone predicted, not mentioned I, and the short list, not whispered in Vatican circles, not spotlighted by scholars. His name was Father Matteo Enriquez, a parish priest from the outskirts of Naples, no noble lineage, raised in quiet form by need. He has spent most of his life in places of church visits, but rarely stays. No one pulled strings for him. He knew no one with influence, but someone above Rome had already taken notice. And when Bishop Valente's resignation was quietly confirmed, another name was spoken, this time by a man who listens more to prayer than to popularity, Pope Leo. And that whisper became a calling. Matteo had spent over 3 decades in service, not in grand halls, but in churches that leaked when it rained, not among dignitaries, but among forgotten. He had cradled dying children in conflict zones. He had buried those the world forgot addicts with no mourners. He lived above the church kitchen, not out of need, but by intention he didn't want. Distance between himself and his people. I don't want to be the one. They seek behind a door, he once said. I want to be the one already at theirs. He never dressed finer than those around him. His shoes were thin, his words were soft, his prayers were few. But honest one night, during a blackout, a woman in labor pounded on the church doors, too far from help, too late for transport. She collapsed in the back row. Mateo delivered her baby there by candlelight. He baptized a child moments later, hands trembling, using water from a cracked font. The story never made headlines. But it turned heaven's gaze, because heaven doesn't scan for the ones who rise. Above it watches for those who reach down. Mateo wasn't the choice a resume would suggest, but Pope Leo wasn't choosing by credentials. He was choosing with tears. What he saw in Mateo wasn't status. It was sacred poverty, not performance, but presence not dry, but devotion. The Vatican statement was short. It named him simply Father Mateo Enriquez, appointed Bishop of the Diocese of Bento. There was no ovation, no ceremony, not. Even Mateo seemed ready for it. When he was told, he wept not from happiness, but from holy fear. I've always served behind the curtain. He said, why would God ask me to step into the light now? But he didn't turn it down. He rose quietly the next morning. He was seen seated beside a homeless man outside the basilica. No spotlight. Just presence. His new vestments had arrived, but he still wore the old, because holiness isn't something you put on. It's what's left when everything else is gone. Some called it unexpected, others called it grace, but those who looked closely knew what it truly was, a reversal, the kind the gospel never stopped promising. The last brought forward, the low raised up, though overlooked, and trusted not to exalt one man, but to remind the church God still sees. When we think he's silent, he's choosing. When we feel unseen, he's remembering. Mateo's life wasn't a strategy. It was a quiet testimony that love is the only credential God requires to send someone further. He didn't seek position. He didn't climb. He was lifted. And that's what gives it meaning, because the church isn't being rebuilt with plans. It's being renewed through surrender. Subscribe to Bible stories and teachings. If you believe God still calls a hidden one, still moves from the margin, still appoints those who never asked to lead. And if not, leave a comment. What holds you back from stepping forward when no one's looking at night? He sat alone in the chapel, the lights dimmed. The incense long gone, only the small flame of the sanctuary lamp remained flickering and quiet beside him. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, known for his smile, his kindness, his steady faith, had no words, yet he had received news. Only hours earlier, the bishop removed a new one chosen, and something in the church had changed. He didn't resist it. He wasn't surprised. He didn't object, but still he grieved, because the man Dismissio Valente had been his brother. They hadn't always agreed, but they had broken bread, together carried burdens side by side, shared the pulpit in hard seasons, and stood shoulder to shoulder when the cries of the faithful echoed loud. Tagle had known his flaws, his strictness, his hesitations, his inability to bend even when grace blew like a wind. But he also remembered the loyalty, the deep love, the unshakable commitment to doctrine, tradition. The structure Valente didn't yield, not out of pride, but out of fear that the church might crack if he didn't. Tagle had known that fear once he could still. Recall the early days of Leo's papacy, the quiet promise of change in the air roles being reshaped, the slow turn toward mercy, instead of control, toward closeness, instead of hierarchy. It had once seemed impossible that the church could shift without losing its center. Now he found himself in that same stillness again, caught between what was and what must come. He didn't question Leo. His trust ran deeper than that. He loved him, because Leo wasn't just rearranging rules. He was realigning hearts, but love doesn't always make following simple, and even when your mind agrees, your heart can still ache. Tagle leaned forward in the pew, fingers laced, head bowed. For a long time he didn't speak. He only breathed. He only waited. And then softly from the stillness came one line. Lord, he whispered, help me stay faithful even when I don't yet understand. The room offered no reply, but a quiet peace settled over him like a shawl draped gently across his shoulders. Later, speaking privately with young priest, Tagle spoke with the voice of someone who had walked through fire and found God waiting on the other side. This isn't a replacement, he said softly. It's a realignment. And there was a kind of clarity that only shows up when obedience caused something. Realignment, not erasure, not dismissal, not a rejection of the one who came before, but a re-entering, not around preference or policy, but around Christ. Tagle wasn't in tears anymore. His voice still carried grief, but now it carried strength too, because sorrow doesn't always mean regret. Sometimes it simply means you're paying attention. He rose from the pew, made the sign of the cross with care, and stepped out into the night like a man who had laid something to rest and was now ready to carry what remained. And in that movement there was obedience, not imposed, but chosen obedience that hurts, but trust obedience that surrenders without needing full clarity, obedience shaped like the cross itself. Subscribe to Bible stories, teachings. If you've ever had to follow when your heart lagged behind, when your mind had questions, when your soul had to walk through silence first, and if not, share in the comments, what have you let go of, or what are you still holding on to? It started quietly, a name unfamiliar to most of Bishop few had imagined, but in the silence that followed, something deeper moved, because this wasn't just a local decision. It wasn't just about Valente or Mateo or even Cardinal Tagle. It was about the church, its stance, its rhythm, its heart. One resignation, one surprise, an appointment. And suddenly something in the air had shifted. Those paying attention began to murmur, "This isn't random, this is deliberate." Because under Pope Leo, the church wasn't simply being reorganized, it was being grounded. A quiet change was weaving its way through the body, not with headlines, but with conviction. Gone were the days when leadership came from polished sermons and institutional ties. Now it was emerging from the edges, from small towns and weary parishes, from pastors who carried the scent of their flock and chose silence over spectacle. Under Leo, titles didn't lead testimonies. Did those once passed over too humble, too plain, too slow to climb, were being noticed, and slowly the keys were being handed to hands that had never expected to hold them. The old model favored closeness to Rome. Leo was gently shifting that, not to lessen leadership, but to bring it closer to those that exist to serve. Bishops were no longer selected for their diplomacy, but for their wounds. Priests weren't rising through eloquence, but through endurance, and the church began to lean, not abruptly, but unmistakably, towards something new. Because when a bishop from the margins is lifted and a cardinal chooses silence to learn from it, a truth begins to emerge that holiness isn't forged in echo chambers. It lives in quiet places, in prison cells, in sick rooms, in shelters, and in homes where mothers light candles no one else sees. This wasn't collapse. This was memory of a call first spoken by the water, not within stone chambers. Memory of the one who stood beside the sick and scarred, not just the scholar's memory that the message isn't held together by rituals, but by love that lands where no one's looking. And so as Leo made each quiet change, he wasn't crafting something new. He was brushing dust off something ancient, a base hidden under layers of fear, image, and control. But beneath all that, the heart was still there, alive, tender, holy. He didn't tear out old stone. He breathed into it. And that breath shifted everything. There's a tremor in the church now, not a collapse, but a quiet, sacred shake. It doesn't knock down walls, it shifts old patterns. It breaks pride's grip. It cracks open sealed off corners. And yes, it unsettles them, because stillness feels safe and movement feels like a threat. But the spirit was never still, just grounded. And now it moves again. It's calling leaders from the corners, guides from the side streets, holy ones from the edges, those who whisper but walk with purpose, who hold scripture in one hand, healing in the other, who don't need applause, just truth. And this isn't destruction. It's refinement, not a fading, a sharpening. A church that hears before it speaks, that grieves before it teaches, that bows before it climbs. This is not a church that's grown weak. It's a church that's remembering why it exists. The wind is changing, the oil is flowing again. And it's the spirit, not the system, that's making the choices. If you felt even the smallest stir, like something deeper is moving through the church, then maybe that's the spirit too, not calling for applause, but for all. And if that doesn't move you, then leave a comment. What tradition are you afraid might disappear? If real renewal finally arrives, this isn't just about the Vatican. It's not just a bishop stepping down, a pope shifting direction, or a cardinal choosing silence. It's about you, because the church was never built out of columns or councils. It's built from souls, from hearts that keep showing up week after week, quietly holding on to the hope that there's something more. And when heaven starts reordering its leaders, when unfamiliar names are raised and familiar ones are let go, ask yourself, what is God rearranging in me? What parts of my life have hardened? What patterns have I protected for so long? They become walls. What beliefs have turned into reasons not to listen? What quiet appointment have I ignored just because it didn't come with a title or attention or recognition? Which parts of your life are still off limits to obedience? You've seen the change from a distance. You've seen a pope redefine leadership. You've seen bishops chosen not for their ambition, but for their humility. And still you've waited like this is something happening over there. But what if it's not? What if this entire shift is God's soft invitation to your soul to ask what needs to go and what needs to rise? Maybe it's a silence you've avoided, a confession you've delayed, a calling you've pushed Aside beneath the weight of everything else, maybe it's your own voice you've been quieting the part of you that once trusted God could use you now, not later, not once you had it all together. Because God isn't only shifting leadership, he's awakening the whole body. And your place in it matters. He's not only calling clergy to the edges, he's calling parents, teachers, carers, artists, elders. And those who feel invisible, he's asking the everyday to carry what's sacred, and maybe what you've seen as a delay was never rejection, just preparation. Don't wait for Rome to move before you find your way back to prayer. Don't wait for a Vatican statement before you listen to what God already said on that commute, in that sleepless night, in that ache you've written off as chance. You're not too late. You're not disqualified. You haven't been left behind. But you might need to let go of what you thought was necessary to make space for what heaven is truly offering. This isn't a story about power structures. It's just a story about holiness, and holiness often begins not when we ask God to explain things, but when we ask him to step into our fear, our plans, our waiting, our hesitation. And if you're being real with yourself, you know there's something you've kept off limits, something you've told God he can have just not yet, not until the timing's right, not until it doesn't hurt, not until the risk feels smaller. But the gospel doesn't wait, it invites, and that invitation is yours today, not to fix the church, not to change the world, but to let God shape you quietly, gently, completely, because the Spirit isn't only moving in cathedrals, it's moving in living rooms and hospital rooms and quiet corners where surrender still is a cost if you're ready to let God do the work, where no one sees, but where heaven sees everything. Then stay with us. And if not, then say in the comments what part of your soul still fears what surrender might take that night. Cardinal Tagle sat in stillness the bishop had. Stepped down, a new shepherd had taken his place, the world moved on. But something inside him didn't. He had watched a brother leave, not because of disgrace, but because of quiet refusal, not because of loud defiance, but because he couldn't take the steps renewal asked him. And he had watched another man, unnoticed by most, step forward, not driven by ambition, but by simple yes. He had stood there between them, one hand holding on to what was, the other slowly opening to what might be. Outwardly he said nothing, but inwardly he wrestled not with Leo's silence, but with God's, the kind of silence that waits until you stop talking, the kind that only speaks once you've given up trying to understand everything. Maybe that's why when the moment came, he bowed his head and said what only someone changed by deep love could say: this is a replacement, it's a realignment. There was no resentment in him, just honor what had been and a quiet fear for what was now beginning. He understood something most never will, that obedience isn't about control. It's about surrendering to something you can't fully explain. Sometimes the truest faith is stepping back, blessing what you don't entirely grasp, and choosing to trust. Anyway, what would you have done in Tagle's place? Would you have stood guard over the past just because it was comfortable? Would you have resisted the new because it wasn't born from your own vision? Or would you have found your way to the chapel, dropped to your knees, and laid aside what you wanted so God's PL? And could move forward. The church is shifting, but not in a rush. It's moving with purpose. Pope Leo leads with quiet steps, but what he carries is too holy to be hurried. He isn't chasing approval. He's chasing obedience. And in doing so, he's showing all of us how to loosen our grip so that Christ can truly take the lead again. From beginning to end, this story wasn't about politics. It was about posture. It wasn't about who stayed or who stepped up. It was about what God needed for the next part of the journey. And if anything in this has stirred your heart, maybe God's asking you to, or have you chosen certainty over surrender? Where are you holding on to the old even as it starts to split? Where you still hesitating to listen when heaven is already speaking? Follow along, not to consume content, but to feel conviction, not for entertainment, but for awakening. And if you still won't, then answer this in the comments. What truth are you still not ready to hear?